Hola, hola, amiga. Did you know that the United States is the only country among 41 nations that does not mandate any paid leave for new parents? Well, considering this shocking yet not surprising statistic, how do mamas navigate their preparation for maternity leave? Well, no worries, amiga. I got you covered. In this episode, we welcome Arianna Taboada, who is the founder of The Expecting Entrepreneur, a consulting firm that helps entrepreneurs design parental leave plans that meet their business model and personal needs. Her highly personalized services incorporate her expertise as a maternal health professional and her own experience as a business owner and mother. In this episode, we talk about maternity leave policies in the United States, when to start thinking about parental leave and how to approach it with your boss, and how to fund your parental leave, to name a few. If you are a soon to be mommy and have been wondering how to prepare your maternity leave, Arianna shares some helpful tips to get started. So you would not want to miss this episode. Welcome to the Viva la Mami podcast. I am your host, Jessica Cuevas. I am a mother of two on a mission to help redefine the meaning of motherhood as a modern Latina mom. Motherhood can be a complex journey, interwoven in two identities that often make us feel ni de aquí ni de allá. Viva la Mami is committed to providing you with knowledge, tools, and support to navigate the challenges and triumphs of motherhood as Latina moms. On the show, we'll be discussing culturally relevant topics that will help inform and empower you in whichever season you are in on your motherhood journey. We'll be joined by Latina moms, experts and professionals who can offer advice, practical tips, relatable stories, and honest conversations. So bring your cafecito as I invite you to be a part of this space as we create comunidad about the exciting and challenging parts of being a mommy. Ahora, vámonos. Hola, hola, Ariana. How are you?
Hey, I'm really good, and I'm excited to be here with you today, Jessica.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. What I really wanted to do is to have you here to educate us and to help us understand a little bit more about maternity leave and how to prepare for that, because that is such a big topic as professional women, as entrepreneurs, as just women in general who are employed, and in terms of how to prepare for this next step. And so before we delve into the conversation, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So right now I live with my family in the Bay Area in California, and I grew up between the Bay Area and central Mexico. So grew up being a binational, bicultural, bilingual situation, and at this point have moved either with my family growing up or my own family with my husband and my son back and forth between the two countries about 7 times. So spending a couple years here, a couple years there. So we're here for now. um, and yeah, grew up, like I said, with my own family doing that binational, and now with my partner and son as well.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so, what really inspired you to create your platform, The Expecting Entrepreneur?
Yeah. So I did my graduate school in the US. I went to social work school and then also did a degree in maternal child health. But then I had my early career in Mexico, and social workers are not clinical in Mexico. So the options was really like go work for a government agency or branch out on my own. And so I decided to branch out on my own and was focused based on my previous work and training on the perinatal space largely. But the more I started working with people, the more I started realizing a lot of the people who I see are self employed. And the number one thing that was coming up in terms of perinatal challenges or especially postpartum struggles was the reality of not having access to maternity leave. So I started seeing if I could focus resources on that. And at that point, I was just like thinking about a book. That was back in 2013. And 10 years later, have had a lot of opportunities to both coach women, consult on these topics, and also write a book on it.
Yeah, that is awesome. And with being an entrepreneur, I'm sure that you can make your own laws, right? There really isn't a guide necessarily, but the fact that you created this, it can be a way to understand where to start and where to go from point A through point Z in the process. And so I really am thankful that you created this, because I'm sure that there is a need, especially for entrepreneurs out there who are not really sure where to start as far as with their maternity leave. And yeah, and we can delve a little bit more related to that specific topic. But for now, can you tell us from an evidence-based information about what are the benefits of parental leave? Like, why is it important to utilize it if it is offered?
Yeah. One of the amazing things is that we actually have decades of evidence on parental leave because so many countries have implemented it and have taken the time to study what happens when you have a universal policy at the federal level. So there's a couple of different kind of branches of evidence. One of them is around really health related outcomes. And so there's a robust body of evidence around the positive impact that parental leave policies have on initiating and maintaining breastfeeding for families who go that route, on parental mental health, on kind of family mental health overall, also on maternal infant attachment. And so that's one area. And then another branch that's really interesting to see, that's a newer body of research. So instead of 30 years, it was like in the last 10 years, we have a bunch of evidence on this, which is the association between parental leave and workplace equity. And one of the interesting findings there is really there's been a lot of work to understand like what amount of leave really creates gender equity or is associated with gender equity. And 6 months is about the amount of time that's been found in the US. That's oftentimes unheard of or like an extremely long and framed as like a generous policy, where in other places it's pretty normal. And the key to some of this gender equity lens is that gender neutral parental leave policies actually lead to that. So when there's only maternity leave policies, it actually can widen some of the gender inequities that exist. But when there's a gender neutral policy that applies to all parents, regardless of gender identity, regardless of who gave birth, regardless if you adopted or did a foster to adopt or through surrogacy or had a kind of gestational pregnancy, that really when we have these kind of umbrella coverage, then that is what can lead to some really positive outcomes across both health and workplace equity.
Yeah. Yeah, I find it so interesting how there has been evidence-based information about this, yet there are some countries like the US where they haven't yet implemented a universal parental leave. And we all know that. We all know that the United States doesn't have a mandated like federal parental leave. And so considering that, what are the current maternity leave policies in the United States? Are there any? Are all states created equal, or does it vary by state to state? So for context, I live in Illinois and you live in California. How does that relate, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that from nationally to like state level?
Yeah, so I mean, you laid it out really clearly. Like, we do not have a federal parental leave policy in this country. We're the only high income country that doesn't. What we do have that people might have heard of is the Family Medical Leave Act, so FMLA, which was established under the Clinton administration. And what that provides is 12 weeks of protected unpaid leave if you have worked at an organization for more than 12 months, if that organization has more than 50 people. So there are some like caveats, and a lot of people are not protected by FMLA due to those caveats. And so what that allows or what that protects is basically you're not allowed to get fired for taking, whether it's for parental leave or for a medical leave or caregiving leave in general. And then states have in some ways stepped up to fill the actual parental leave gaps. You talked about the example of Illinois and California. So California has one of the oldest state paid leave programs in the country, and it's in alongside a growing number of states. So I always look at my notes here to make sure I have the latest, because there's new laws passing pretty much every couple of months now. So We have 9 states and DC that currently have some paid leave policy on the books and rolled out. So it's Rhode Island, California, New Jersey, New York, DC, the state of Washington, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Oregon, and Colorado is rolling out in 2024. And then we have four other states that just passed their paid leave policies and will start rolling out in 2026. Maryland, Delaware, Minnesota, and Maine. So you notice I didn't say Illinois.
Yep.
That's only like 15 out of 50 states total. And so there's still plenty of room to go in terms of improvement. And it varies state to state in terms of how much time the state programs cover and also how much coverage. So what percentage of your income you can expect to be paid out.
So is this like income specific, or is it based on employment? If you were a state employee versus an employee who works for a private sector, like how does that really look like?
So everyone in the state the coverage is applied equitably. But different states have different amounts of coverage. So like California aims to cover up to, I think it's 66% of your income. And other states might cover up to 90%. Some states cover as low as 50%. And that, like when we're talking about what does that actually translate to dollars and cents wise, it's usually right now between $850 to like $1,100 per week. So depending on what kind of job you and what kind of salary you normally make, that's where there's great variation. Like, oh, is that equivalent to 50% of your income or 90% of your income? And some companies will additionally do this like topping up practice. So whatever the state doesn't cover, some companies will pitch in and they call it making you whole. So they'll fill in the gap between what the state covers and what your salary otherwise normally would have been.
Interesting. And I think it works for some employers that do offer paid parental leave. Like with my most recent company, I qualified for 6 weeks paid. But if I wanted more and be under FMLA, which is like the 12 weeks, I could use an additional 6 weeks, but that would be under short-term disability. So this was with this current, like with my most recent baby. But with my first baby, I worked at a non-for-profit and they didn't even have a maternity leave or parental leave policy. So I had to use FMLA, but I wasn't employed for 12 months. I hadn't yet hit the first year yet when my baby was born. So I didn't qualify for FMLA. So I had to exhaust all of my vacation and sick days. Now, assuming that I had planned for my pregnancy, right? Assuming that I had accrued all of this time and it wasn't enough. So then what I had to do was participate in this like bank for people to donate their hours for me. That still wasn't enough to have at least 12 weeks. And that was something that I wanted. I wanted 12 weeks. I guess that is usually the default in the United States, even though it's not enough because you said it's 6 months. 6 months is usually a good amount of time, if not minimum, for bonding with baby. And it wasn't enough even with this bank that I qualified. So then I had to get a special approval to still be employed and found a loophole to just get unpaid leave. And I was just like mind blown because first of all, this was an organization it was a college and where a lot of women are employed. I would say 60% of women are employed. Okay. The HR director was a woman. My HR rep was a woman. And it almost seemed like I had to be satisfied. I had to be happy with what was offered. And they were just very nonchalant, like, oh yeah, this is what it is. And for me, I'm like, this isn't fair. And I just don't know if this is like a similar sentiment for most people. But for me, I'm like, first of all, 12 weeks isn't enough. And you're telling me that I should find loopholes to figure out my maternity leave. when there's so many things going on in my head and just I don't even know how to navigate this process. And I consider myself a first generation student where I am a first generation professional as well. And navigating that is just even harder because I didn't know and I still don't know really how to ask the right questions. And so, considering all of this and like me sharing my story, do you think that the US will ever progress toward a universal paid parental leave? Is there any hope so that women and men, parents, expected parents, can have at least this thing, this less item to do or even think about as they're planning their parental leave?
Yeah. And I think your story really gets to the heart of we leave it up to every individual person to have to figure out what am I going to do now when if we looked at it as like a scenario to expect because there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people going through this every year, then if we were to create resources or structure at scale, it would save a lot of time, effort, cost, heartache
Yeah.
for for everyone who has to feel like they're reinventing the wheel or trying to figure it out or even trying to figure out what questions to ask, like you said. And the good news is that there is really strong bipartisan support for a parental leave. The challenge is that it continually gets dropped from the priority policies that are on the table for passing. And that's consistently happened since 93 when FMLA was passed. Every couple of years, there's a lot of groundswell. There's some great organizations really dedicated to parental leave policy, and they organize a lot of their base is mostly working class paid leave advocates. And there's been like growing kind of narratives shared out, and there is from both sides of the aisle advocates for paid leave. And so I ask myself the same question of like, why has this not passed yet? Policymakers ask themselves the same question. Advocates, why has this not passed yet? It's confusing and repeatedly disappointing when like every 5 years you think it stands a chance because there is strong support and then it gets chopped.
Yeah, and would you know what is it that they're trying to get past? Is it I know that people say, "Oh, we want nationally like mandated paid parental leave." But what does that consist of? Does it consist of just 12 weeks? Does it consist of 6 months? Or is there nothing just written out there yet?
Yeah. So the latest proposals that were on the table last year were for 3 months. And so it felt like people were modeling after what if we could take FMLA up a notch? And so it was 3 months paid. And the proposal for how that would be covered is a lot like Social Security. So people would be paying in very small amounts from their paycheck or as part of their taxes. And then that creates a pool of money that can be tapped into when people need it. And it would be for family and medical leave. So because a lot of the arguments are like, what if I never have a baby? And then I'm just paying into a system that I will never use. And the reality is, if we call it a family medical leave and if we make it truly accessible, everyone is going to have a medical need, pretty much everyone at some point. And there's going to be a time in your life where you're either caring for someone else and can tap into that, or you need care yourself and you can tap into that.
That would be awesome, I would say.
I
Yeah,
agree.
that would be great. I know. And is there something that we can do as like voters, or is it just, something that we need to push with on? Is it more like on a local level or national level?
So it's going to sound like so corny, but this is in the states that have gotten it passed. This has been what works is to literally write your Congress people, write your
Mm,
representative, and see if paid leave is one of the kind of items that they are prioritizing or ask them to prioritize. Just saying, I'm a constituent and this is one of the top issues that matters to me. And oftentimes at a state level, especially if you're in a state that hasn't passed a paid leave policy, that is a great way to push for that. At a national level, Main Street Alliance is an organization that I often point people to. And again, their base tends to be working class, small business owners, they started organizing around health insurance for people who were excluded from like employer-based health insurance, and then have expanded to paid leave as one of their main issues. And they have a website where you can add your name to a petition, and they'll send out emails with updates around if there's a state that is putting paid leave on their platform and you want to share a story because you're in that state or something like that. So Main Street Alliance, we can link in the show notes. They're a great
Yeah,
organization.
absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that resource. Yeah, and I think it's as mamas and as future mamas for us to be involved in such an important topic. For me, like I'm already done with my two kiddos, so I will not have to use a maternity leave unless something happens unexpectedly. But I would definitely be involved in this because I don't want another mom to go through this, another parent to go through this, especially for dads or same sex couples that wouldn't necessarily qualify for a parental leave because it's only utilized as a maternity leave. You have to have a baby to utilize it. And so I'm all for it. And I hope that through what you're sharing and what I'll put on the show notes, hopefully we can have some action there. And that way, yeah, people can be involved and literally push for change. Because, yeah, I think it's an embarrassment for the United States to not have something like this, which is a shame. But considering all of this, that there isn't a national paid parental leave policy in the United States, as far as with bringing this up to your employer, it's almost like you are forced to have this decision be done on your end, right? Like no one else is going to vouch for you otherwise than yourself. So like when should one start thinking about parental leave, and how do you approach it to your boss or HR for those that are employed?
Trying to find where there is written down like a parental leave policy, if your organization has one, is one of the first steps you can take. Sometimes I know a lot of people who have started doing this, again, regardless of whether or not they're having children or plan to have more children, who have started asking just as part of the interview process to get a sense of, are you the type of organization that supports families? And then if you're in a situation where where your family is growing and you're trying to find out, like, what do I have access to? Seeing if you can track down a written policy. Sometimes this is in like an employee handbook. And if it's not available right away, then often asking around, talking to someone who has recently taken leave can be a good way to, before formally going to HR, to just get a sense of what do I have access to? And to pair that also with what are my legal rights? Again, knowing, am I in a state where I legally have the right to have my job protected or to have this amount of paid leave? And sometimes HR is obviously trying to protect the company's best interest. So not just knowing what is your company policy, but also knowing what do I actually have the rights to in my particular state or situation. And then around second trimester is when I've seen people start preparing a leave plan. So oftentimes the relationship with your manager and the ability to say, yes, I am going out on leave. And managers can feel all kinds of different ways about it, right? And being able to share, this is the plan I've been thinking about. I'm going to take this many weeks and I'll need coverage in these areas, or I've been thinking about how X, Y, and Z person could help step in and fill this. These are the things that we might have to pause. And so doing a little kind of reflection and planning for yourself can be one way to have kind of a positive start to the conversation, so that it becomes one where it's, wow, this person has clearly thought about what their needs are, what the role or the organization might need from them during this time. So a little pre-thinking can be a good start to the conversation.
Yes. Yeah, what I did was I knew that there was a coworker who had just came back from maternity leave when I first started with the company when I was first pregnant with my firstborn, and she was like my mentor. I would say my maternity leave mentor because I asked her, I was like, "Okay, how do you approach this? What kind of questions did you ask?" And again, coming from a first generation professional lens, like My mom didn't even have, they didn't even qualify for parental leave back then when she had us. And so I didn't have really a foundation, if you will, to know where to go. And so I'm really thankful that if it wasn't for her, I don't even know if I would have known about this bank or found that loophole to find that unpaid leave, if you will. And so, yeah, for anyone listening out there, definitely find someone who had taken a maternity leave before you. That way you have a better understanding as far as with how or where they went or how they navigated this process, because it can be intimidating. You're already in a vulnerable state, and I don't know, for me, it was very awkward, I think, to approach this to a boss or a manager. And again, this is just me speaking from that first gen lens. But I think that at the end of the day, we all should vouch for ourselves and advocate for ourselves, because otherwise no one can. And really talking about what you want out of your maternity leave and not, a complacer the company, because that's oftentimes what as Latinas we tend to do. It's I'll stick with what they told me, or I'll just be totally complacent to what they said. And oftentimes, no, we need to literally advocate for yourselves.
And it can be hard if you're a first time parent. Sometimes you're like, I don't know what I need, or like everyone else just that I know took 10 days, which actually in the US is the like average amount of time people take off after giving
Wow.
birth. um,
Wow.
and so it might feel like, am I asking for the right things? Am I asking for too much? Will I even get what I'm asking for? And that's where some of that, like having the comadres who can tell you, this is what we did, this is what I got, these are the tips and strategies I have. And it's like parenting. It's having those people who have recently been through the experience makes a huge difference in knowing what your options are, what to expect, how you might handle different situations. And and it can give you a sense of, these are what people around me had, and give you an opportunity to think about, what do I want during this transition? What would be like, even if it feels like a luxury, like dream about what would be my ideal version of parental leave. And yes, in reality, we live in a system and a structure where you might not get all of those things, but having an idea of what your ideal version would be can help you narrow in on, so what am I going to advocate, and what am I going to draw a boundary around? There are some places that even when you're on leave, they're like, expect you to answer emails or phone calls. And if no, I want to be totally off, then knowing how to set up and draw that boundary can be important.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that. And so, for mamas whose employer does not offer an FMLA or leave policies, or for those that don't qualify, like in my case, what would you advise them to do?
Yeah. So this is the hack it yourself, try and put together patchwork, oftentimes your own leave. So sometimes that means looking at financials and just trying to figure out, based on our family's needs, what is the amount of time I could even take off. And some people do end up having to make choices about, oh, do I like do like some crowdsourcing, some fundraising? How do I feel about putting some things on a credit card if I decide to take more weeks than I actually have salary or savings to support? And so that's one situation that people often find themselves in, is having to really look at finances and figure out what is realistic based on my family's needs. And and oftentimes we have to make hard choices, or choices that feel really unfair. So I'll just say that out loud, because I think that's the reality for a lot of people. And one other thing that comes up is actually what you described going through, is figuring out if there is short-term disability policy. So that's something that sometimes companies will purchase and you can have access to as part of your benefits. And that's also something to know that is available to small business owners or self-employed people. The catch is, it's a policy, like a health insurance policy that you purchase through an insurance provider, but it is something that you would have to purchase before you're like getting ready to have your kid, right? So you can't already be pregnant and decide to go out and purchase a disability policy. So it's something to look into if you know that you're in a profession that doesn't have, where you don't have parental leave benefits, or if you are self-employed, looking into purchasing a short-term disability policy is a good option.
Yeah, I didn't even know that you can do that as a small business owner or entrepreneur. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
it's kind of whatever insurance broker you purchased car insurance for or home insurance for, you can ask,
Yeah,
do you have a recommended short-term disability insurance
that's
policy?
yeah, that's awesome. So you mentioned that you have to look at finances and work it through that if in case you don't have parental leave options with your employer. What happens though, or have you stumbled upon like people who have lower wage jobs? How does that look like?
So right now there's an estimated like over 100 million working people who don't have access to a single day of paid leave. And that is primarily made up of workers who are women, who are gig workers, who are low income or kind of minimum wage workers, and communities of color are overrepresented in all those categories. And so a lot of people basically end up like relying on state sick leave or whatever sick days they may have the right to, and then go back to work. And so that's where we end up with the average of 10 days, most birthing people going back to work within 10 days of giving birth, because that's about how much protected sick leave you would have access to on average.
Yeah, it's just to show you that the populations that are mostly impacted are women of color and who are perhaps in service oriented jobs and are perhaps not given enough time for leave. And I often think about my mom, my abuelita, who used to work in a factory. And I think she said that she had to return like within 2 weeks. So like 10 days. And this was like, what, 40, 50 years ago. And it's just mind boggling how like this still exists today in 2023. And that creates a lot of injustice, not just for the parent but also for the child. When you mentioned going back to those that data information, how it typically takes 6 months, right? That 6 months is usually golden for a lot of women to return back to work, where in fact, many don't even have that. Like, I would say none of us. Like, I have never heard of someone going back to work after 6 months within my network and community. So I don't know. It's just not fair. This is just me venting at this point. And so, as far as with keeping that in mind, are there some like networks or organizations that help parents get resources or just like assistance with parental leave? Is there anything that exists out there?
Um, so one organization that I often point to, because they have done a really great job of making it clear like what parental leave policies state by state are like and what you have access to, is Better Balance. And so it's, I think the website is betterbalance.org, but we can link to it in show notes. And what they have done is just like lay out in plain language what you have the rights to based on where you live. Again, they've focused mostly on the states that have past paid leave policies, because the unfortunate reality is if you live in one of the other states, you do not have access to that much. And so I think that's one part, is because these these aren't conversations that you're having until you are come up against a situation of needing to take leave, right? So it's not like common knowledge. It's a system that's pretty complex, and you have a short window of time to learn about all of the things you need to do and how to navigate it. So that's one resource for learning in plain language. How does this work?
Yeah.
And what are some of the things that I have the right to ask for and the protections I have? Another organization that I would name is Postpartum Support International, because they have really built such an incredible network in all states and internationally as well, the postpartum support. Because one of the things that happens with the lack of parental leave infrastructure is you end up with some pretty challenging physical, mental, emotional struggles postpartum that if you're back to work full time, you do not have the time and oftentimes the energy to go seek out care for. So they have a lot of resources and they have affinity groups. So they have Spanish language resources, they have resources for military, they have resources for Black identified moms, for Desi identified moms, for queer families. And they've done a really great job of, given the context of lack of parental leave, figuring out what can we provide people in their homes and their communities that fit into their lives in this postpartum period. So I love Postpartum Support International. I used it myself as a new
Yes.
mom.
Yes, I love that organization as well. And thank you so much for mentioning that, because even though it may not be only tied in with parental leave, but it is part of that process, right? As far as with the postpartum process. And so thank you for sharing that. And I'll make sure to share that in the show notes. As far as with entrepreneurs, what, this is your baby right here, what sort of process should self-employed people look for when as they're preparing for maternity leave?
Yeah, so I would say parental leave for entrepreneurs includes a lot of the things that you would think about if you are employed by a larger organization. And so around that second trimester period, figuring out what is my plan. And what often happens for entrepreneurs is that because you're not in a large organization, a lot of the responsibility is usually on the business owner. So trying to figure out, I can think of what can you delegate? What can you automate? What are you going to need to pause as a business owner? And so there's a lot of different operational questions that come up when you're self-employed. And so figuring out some of those, the core business operations and what types of things need to keep happening without you there, and what are the ways those things can keep happening, ends up being a big focus. I would say the silver lining for entrepreneurs is oftentimes that because there is no parental leave policy at an organization that you have started, then it becomes an opportunity to really figure out what would be a maternity leave policy that could work for me. And in employer scenarios, there usually is like an expectation of the day after your parental leave ends, like you go back, there's no transition period. Whereas for entrepreneurs, you can oftentimes build a transition period of going back a few days a week at first, or going back part-time, or I know a lot of entrepreneurs who actually decide to stay part-time their first like year back from leave. And so there's some flexibility. And I will say that even if you're at an employer, I see more and more like return to work processes. And so I think organizations are thinking about how can we not just provide a parental leave, but how do we make a family friendly workplace? And part of that is allowing this longer time to transition back, because it is a huge life transition and you're going through a lot. And so you need time to reintegrate with your schedule, your identity, how work fits into the rest of your life as well.
Yes, absolutely. And your book, The Expecting Entrepreneur, does it mention all of that? Like how one can prepare for this whole entire process as entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I keep a little copy that I keep close to me at all times. And it does go through a lot of the steps I just talked about. So it has a whole chapter on imagining your ideal leave and what does that look like for you. It has a section on talking to other people who have been through this process before and figuring out what are the things they did that I could learn from. And then goes into the financial aspects and the return to work. And then in a workplace, there's like an approach to letting people know, those closest to you work with, who will be impacted. And oftentimes business owners are trying to figure out, how do I let people know? How do I let people know? Do I let my clients know? Do I let like contractors that I've been working with know? So there's a section around communicating communicating your leave and a bunch of scripts I've gathered from over the years, helping people announce their leave or figure out how to share the news. Because that's another really personal aspect that all of a sudden something so personal becomes like a workplace communication thing that you have to talk
Mm.
about.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Yeah, at my most recent employer, there were like birth announcements company wide. And for me, I felt so uncomfortable just looking at like someone else's babies, like photos on my inbox. And I'm like, and I literally told my boss, I was like, I'm going to share it with just the team. Please do not share it through the entire company. I just feel weird about it. But yeah, I never thought about that as an entrepreneur as well, and who those stakeholders may be wary of or not. So yeah, I really appreciate you writing this book because I think it can serve as a guide and a way for entrepreneurs and self-employed folks to really know and understand how they can plan their parental leave. So I'll make sure to share your book as well in the show notes because I think it would be very impactful and helpful for those that are self-employed. So thank you.
Mm.
Yeah. So, as far as with maternity leave, parental leave in general, we know that from those initial conversations that we make with ourselves or our families and our bosses, employers, to the execution of it, I feel like it is very stressful. It's time consuming because you have to put in so much towards it. And this is just like the planning stages. How can one find support or even coping mechanisms to ease their mental health as they are planning their parental leave?
Yeah, so you're right. It's like a very, it's like a project with a very like non-negotiable deadline, basically. And some people work really well under that kind of pressure. I am not one of them. So if you're also not one of them, it can feel like a high anxiety time. And that's something that I normalize is that people talk a lot about postpartum mental health things, but actually like anxiety, stress, depression during pregnancy is pretty common. It's like anxiety is present in like 20%. And so if you are starting to feel like I'm like freaking out, like I don't know how to prepare, really anxious about preparing, I just want to normalize that. And I often think about who are the professional listeners in your life and how can you tap on them. And so building support networks even early on in pregnancy is one of the practices and, like you were saying, coping mechanisms that I often think about. And when I say professional listener, I just mean someone who will listen without judgment, who will, if you want just to be listened to or if you want advice. And that could be just a very experienced listener in your family. It could be that, yeah, who you always go to because you know that she, no matter what you say, will just sit there and nod and take it in. And that when you're ready for it, if you're ready for it, you could ask for advice. And it might be, so it's one end of the spectrum of a professional listener you might have in your network. Another end of the spectrum might be therapy. And so that's something that if you have access to mental health support is a great resource to tap into. And oftentimes, if you are feeling like the stress or the anxiety is getting to a point where it's overwhelming, then again, Postpartum Support International is always my first. It's always my first go-to. And this day, there's a lot of kind of virtual lower cost options.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that information. I think it's about building community and create a village from the get-go. I think can help ease the nerves, the tension that one has. I remember being so nervous, even like approaching it to my boss as a first-time parent. And it can be overwhelming. It can, and especially because we don't have again, this federal mandated parental leave. We don't know where to go. So thank you for sharing that. So now we're going to shift gears and I'm going to ask two Viva la Mami questions that I ask my guests here on the show. But my first question to you is, what is your meaning of madrehood?
The first thing that came to mind was like getting humbled daily Of there is always of the sense that there is always something new. Like I'm someone who I think grew up with a little bit of like feeling like pressure for perfectionism or not making mistakes. And motherhood is really one of those scenarios where it's like every day I'm going to make at least one mistake. And how do I just take more of a learning mindset, knowing that there's never whatever, even if I could imagine the version of perfect motherhood, I'm never going to get there. And it's not something at this point, after like almost 8 years, the perfection feels more stressful than just trying to go with the flow of whatever each day brings. And before becoming a mother, I don't think I ever would have said that I was like running away or not going in the direction of neat and tidy.
Oh my gosh, I can totally understand. That is me 100% as well. Second question is, what is one tip of advice you have for Latina mommies?
I think some of what we were talking about before of this lack of infrastructure, I find that I had my son in Mexico. And so I think it was different than being in the US context with the infrastructure differences. But I do think some of the deeply just reverence for the process of motherhood, I think transcend whatever country you end up building a family in, having kids in. And I found that to be just so magical. I'm trying to get the words out without going into sad, happy crying, because I think that there was just something comforting about how much respect and holding of that process. And everyone really respected la cuarentena, the 40 days after you give birth. And I wasn't like in my house for that entire time, but other people had the expectation that I would not be doing anything or going anywhere for that time. And so nothing was asked of me. It was very normal that like people would bring me food. And so I think some of those just cultural norms about what it is like to transition into motherhood and the reality that it is very hard work physically. And so other people step up to do things like meals or childcare. And I see that continue to be true even in immigrant communities where there's such a lack of, like here, where there's such a lack of infrastructure for that to be able to be a supported normal part of becoming a mother and postpartum, that communities are like, remember that. And they're like, no, this is not the way it's supposed to happen. And that even in facing structures and policies that would not support that kind of care to happen, that people still commit to providing care in a way that makes sense.
Yes. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ariana, where can people follow you? And if you can provide us a little bit more about where people can buy your book as well.
Sure. TheExpectingentrepreneur.com is the website that has both free resources and a link to the book. It's also, I feel like, a commercial. Anywhere books are sold is where you can find the book.
Yeah.
And in terms of like social, I love connecting with people, and LinkedIn and Instagram are the two places where I spend the most time. My name is my handle on both of those, Arianna Taboada. It's not a particularly easy name to spell, but we'll put it in the show notes if you're interested on connecting there. And I try and post a lot about parental leave, postpartum, for entrepreneurs in general. And so for anyone looking for that type of information, I'd love to connect.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for all of your expertise in this topic. Again, as mamas are preparing for maternity leave, I think I even learned so much, even though I'm done. I officially finished my maternity leave and I decided not to go back to work. And so we can definitely touch on this topic about what it's like returning back to work after maternity leave, because there can be many different ways to do it. But in the meantime, I really want to thank you for being here. And I'm sure many mamas will leave with some wisdom and hope as well. And hopefully we can get some people to write to their legislators about prioritizing on families. I think it's interesting how this country talks about family values, but if there isn't policy set in place that literally align with those values, like how are we supposed to feel like we are listened to? I can go on with that, but I really want to thank you for being here.
It was great to be here.
Thank you for tuning in to the Viva la Mami podcast. If you like this episode, make sure to leave a review and write what episode really resonated with you. If you really loved it, share it on social media or with an amiga. As always, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you are listening. Make sure to follow me at Viva la Mami on Instagram or visit vivalamami.com. Please note the information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be replaced by your healthcare provider nor taken as professional advice.